In the previous video, we created a simple UI system to open pages, UI pages, and close the current UI page, and also to close all pages at once, and a combination of these two to close all pages and open a new one. And one more helper method that checks if we have to disable the page when the new page is opened. So currently the pause menu is open, but if I open the next menu, that is just disabled, and if I close the current UI page, that is going to re-enable. Now we are going to add audio, UI transitions, and events to them. I prepared a new scene and added the UI page script to all the UI panels and the UI page controller to an empty game object, and I've set my pause menu to get disabled when the new page is opened, and I've already assigned all the buttons appropriate method and passed in the appropriate UI page. So when I enter the play mode, nothing is showing up because in a normal game you'd have a script to manage game states, and when we are in the main menu game state, you'd open appropriate UI page, but we don't have that in this. So I'm going to manually enable this. Shortcut is Shift Alt and A to toggle the game object. Everything is rigged except when I open the next page and I click on this play button, it is supposed to call the remove all and add page, but our home page is still enabled. That is because we manually had to enable this game object, right? So this is not really in the stack. This should disable when the new page is pushed, and that happens. And when I close that, it's going to re-enable, and that's it. So first problem is I need a way to push my home page or the initial page. So let's open the UI script, and I'm going to create a serialize field for the initial page, and in the awake function, I'm simply going to add that page. I don't have to check if the initial page is null because we are already doing that inside the add page method. While I'm at it, I'm going to create one more serialize field for an array of UI pages called pages. And before we add the initial page, I'm going to call for each loop that loops through all the pages and calls its close function. Close function simply disables this game object. I'm going to lock the inspector and drag and drop all the pages into this array. And also I'm going to set the initial page as the home page. If I press play, you can see that it is working. So that's great. I've created an empty class called UI transition and UI audio. First, let's work on the UI audio. Back in the UI page, I'm going to create a private variable for the UI audio. And in the open and close method, I'm going to add a new parameter of Boolean called play audio. And when we open the page, after we enable the game object, I'm going to call UI audio dot play opening sound and pass the Boolean parameter. We don't have this method, so I'm going to right click, go to quick actions and generate method. So if I hold control and click on this method, it's going to take me to that method. And by default, it's going to say internal. It's kind of same as public, but I like to keep it as public. And then here, I'm going to perform some operations. But before that, let me also create one more method to play the closing sound. I'm going to do that in the close method before we disable the game object. Shortcut for the quick actions is Alt Enter. In the UI audio, I'm going to create a serialized field of type audio clip for the opening sound and one more for the closing sound. And inside the play opening sound, I'm going to create a if block that checks if the play audio is true and open sound is not null. And here you may have to call your own audio system APIs. But for this example, I'm going to keep it simple and call audio source play clip at point, and this is going to take in the clip. I'm going to pass the open sound, and for the position I'm going to pass camera.main.transform.position. So it is going to play at the camera's position. And let me do the same for the play closing sound, and I'm going to change this internal to public. And that should be it for the UI audio. But let's not forget to assign this component. We can do this in awake function, but we are working with UI panels. So normally you'd have all your UI panels disabled when you play the game. And this awake function won't get called until it is enabled. And if you somehow call open or close before we assign the UI audio, you may get null reference exception. So instead of this, I'm going to turn this into a public method called initialize. And in the UI page controller, before we call the page.close in awake, I'm going to call page.initialize. And that should take care of assigning that variable. Now we have one more problem. We added a new Boolean parameter, right? So we need to pass true or false at appropriate timing. So when we start the game, all the pages are going to get closed. And if we pass true here, they're all going to call their own audio clips. We don't want to do that. So we can pass false here, and same thing here. When we close the previous page, we don't want to play its sound, but we want to play the sound of the new page that is going to get opened. If you don't want to pass this variable everywhere, in fact, we only need to pass true in these two places when we remove the current page and when we add a new page. And rest of the places needs to get false as its a parameter. So what I can do is I'm going to remove these false from these two places, and back in the UI page I can simply set its default value to be true or false like this. Now I don't have to pass any arguments. It is simply going to treat this value to be whatever we are passing here. But if we do pass the parameter like in these lines, it's going to have that value. And finally, I want to add some kind of rule that makes sure that the UI audio component is attached to the game object our UI page is on. For that, I'm going to add a required component and pass the type of UI audio for now. We'll get back to the other one later. Now we can see that all these pages are showing the error icon here that says that this needs the UI audio component. So even if I don't add that component right now and just enter the play mode, it is simply going to tell us that, hey, we needed that component, but you didn't add it. So we went ahead and added that for you. So that's what it does. And similarly, if I try to add the UI page to an empty game object, it is simply going to add that required component as well. So that's how you can make sure that it is always there. I'm going to select all the pages and assign some clip just to test this out. These are from Kenny Assets, so I'll provide the links in the description. Okay, great. Let's start working on the UI transition or UI motion, whatever you want to call it. First, we need to know what type of motion we need on this UI page. For that, I'm going to create a public enum called transition type that is going to have two states for now, none and fade. and create a serialized field for the opening transition and one for the closing transition. To fade this, we are going to attach a canvas group to our UI page. So I'm going to create a private field for that. And in awake, I can get that component and assign it to that. But I already told you why I avoid using awake on UI pages. So I'm going to create a public method called initialize and do it inside that function. Similar to the UI audio, I'm going to create two methods to play the opening transition and closing transition, and both accept a boolean called play transition. And additionally, they're going to accept an action from the systems library called on complete. The idea is to call this action once the transition is complete. Inside the play opening transition method, I'm going to call a if block that's going to check if the play transition is false or the opening transition is the transition type dot none. We're going to exit from this method earlier, and before that we are going to call the onComplete action. Let me copy this and paste it into the closing transition as well. I'm going to add a switch statement with our opening transition, and let me add the missing cases. We have already dealt with what happens if the transition type is none. So I'm going to remove this. But for the fade, I'm going to use prime tween and call its tween.alpha, and this takes in a canvas group as a target. So we already have that. I'm going to pass that. And for the starting value, I want it to go from 0 to 1 because we are opening the page, right? And then we need to pass a duration. Instead of duration, I'm simply going to add a new serialized field of type tween settings called opening tween settings. And while I'm at it, I'm also going to create one for the closing tween. And I will pass that into this. Along with the duration of the tween, setting provides a lot more options in the inspector. And once this tween is played, I'm going to call its onComplete method and pass in our onComplete parameter into that. So basically, this method is going to get called once this canvas groups alpha goes from 0 to 1. And once this is called, I'm simply going to in turn call my parameter. Let me do the same for the closing transition, but here we are changing the alpha from 1 to 0. Back in the UI page, I'm going to add a new field for our UI transition called UI transition and get the component in the initialize function. This class also has an initialize function, so I'm going to call that in here and add a new boolean to check if we can play the transition, and set this also as false as default value. Now I can simply call UI transition dot play opening transition, and for the boolean I can simply pass the play transition, and for the action I can create a new method here, for example, after opening. This is just an example. If you're following, you don't have to do that. So this is what happens. This is how it is going to get called. Whatever you do here is going to happen only after this is done playing whatever transition it needs to play. Instead of creating a new method, we can also pass in something called lambda expression or lambda function, like so. Currently, I don't want to do anything after we open the page, so I'm simply going to call debug.log. Similarly, I can call UI transition.play closing transition and pass in the boolean. And I'm going to create a new lambda expression, but instead of passing just this debug line, we want it to do two things. One, to debug this line, and also one more, to disable this game object. I don't want to disable this game object until this transition is complete, right? So if we are passing more than one line of code, we need to use the block expression like this. And now I can simply move this line into this one and finally call the debug line that says this game object is closed. This time I'm going to proactively drag and drop the UI transition into our UI pages. And I'm going to leave all the main pages as none for the transition. Then I'm going to select all the sub pages and set their opening transition and closing transition to fade. And for the opening, I want it to happen at 0.8 seconds, but I want the closing to happen a little faster. So I'm going to select 0.5. And for the easing, I'm going to set them both to in-out expo for now. You can also select custom and add in your own animation curve. Yeah, I'm going to leave it as custom for the closing tween. Select all the pages one more time and add component and type canvas group and add it to them. And just to be safe, I'm also going to add the required component of type canvas group to the UI transition script. Now everything should be set up. Press play and it's not working. Okay, we forgot one more thing. Back in the UI page controller, we need to pass true when we open a new page and close the current page. Now everything should be working. All right. As you can see, the alpha changes from 0 to 1 and 1 to 0. Now let's try to add more transition types. Next one is zoom. Then we have a slide in all four directions. And these transitions require the component rect transform. So I'm going to add a new private field called rect transform, and inside the initialize function, I can simply get component of rect transform and assign it to this one. And also, before I forget again, let me add that as one of the required component. This is not mandatory, it's just a precaution. Now I'm going to add all the missing cases and remove the none case again. And for the zoom, I'm going to call tween dot scale, and for the target, I'm going to pass rect transform, and I want it to go from vector 3.0 to vector 3.1, and gonna pass the opening tween settings. And finally, I can simply call the onComplete method from here. And you may see a pattern here. Now I have to call onComplete on all these different tweens, right? We can also do this in a different way. Before we call the switch statement, I'm going to create a new variable called tween and initialize that with a new tween. Now I can simply remove these onComplete methods from each tween and instead simply assign those tween to our tween that we created here, like so. And once we exit the switch statement, I can call tween.onComplete just once, and this should be fine. For the slide right, I'm going to call tween.UI anchor position x, pass in rect transform as the target. And for the starting value, I'm going to use the negative value of the rect transform dot rect dot width. This is going to return the width of the UI page. And since we are passing the negative here, it is going to start from the negative side, from the left side. And then I want it to move to 0, that is the center of the screen, because we are going to slide right. And then finally pass the opening tween settings. We are going to start from the positive value of our rect width and move to 0, that is from left side to center. Let's do tween dot UI anchored position y and pass the negative rect height as starting point or slide up, so it goes from bottom to center. And similarly, but in reverse, this is going to go from the positive height to 0, so from top to bottom. And let's do the same for the closing transition. I'm going to create a new variable called tween and assign our alpha tween to that one. Remove this onComplete from here and call it once we exit the switch state, and right click, quick actions, add missing cases, remove the none state. And for zoom, I'm going to do tween.scale, start from a vector 3.1 and go to vector 3.0. By the way, the vector 3.1 is a shorthand for writing new vector 3 and passing 1 for all axes, and vector 0 does the same with 0 for all axes. And for the slide right, we are going to go from 0 to the positive rect width. So we start from the center, that is 0, and go towards its right side. We do the opposite for slide left. We go from center to top for slide up, and go from center to bottom for slide down. Now let's test this out. I'm going to set the settings opening transition to slide down and closing transition to slide up. Let's play this. Great. This is working. And one more neat thing, since the easing is accessible inside the inspector itself, I can change this to whatever I want. So I'm going to set it to outbounds. And look at that. So cool, right? But what happens if I change the closing transition to, let's say, let it fade? So what happens now? Okay, the first time I called it, it worked. It faded away. And you can see that alpha has gone to 0. But if I open it one more time, we see that it is working from here in the scene view, but the alpha value is still 0. Watch the scene now. Okay, keep watching the scene, and I'm going to open now. See, it came from top to bottom, but the alpha value is still 0. So to prevent that, we are going to create a new function called reset transition state. And in here, I'm going to simply reset the canvas group alpha to 1, rect transform local scale to vector 3.1, and rect transform anchor position to vector 2.0. That means center. And I'm going to call this function before and after doing all the transitions. So before we do the transition, it's pretty simple. We just go here and call the reset transition state. Cool. And to do this after transition, we simply add that into our onComplete state. But since this is going to be calling two things, I'm going to use the lambda function again and use the block statement. Now I can add multiple lines. First, I'm going to reset transition state and call onComplete action. And let's do the same here. Before we start the closing transition, I'm going to reset transition state, and after it is done, I'm going to call it again and invoke the action parameter. Let me change the closing settings to fade one more time. It opens, and when I close, it faded away, and when I open again, it works. Great. This is great. And now let's fix one more issue. I'm going to set the closing duration to 5. Before the transition is complete, I'm going to call it again. Now you see that it is still disabled because after calling this, the closing transition was still happening. And when we complete the closing transition, we are asking it to disable the game object, right? There are multiple ways of fixing this, but the simplest way would be inside the reset transition state, I'm going to call tween.stopAll, and this should be fine. This is going to stop all the tweens. But if we pass in a parameter of transform, for example, if I pass the rect transform, this is going to stop all the tweens that are attached to this transform. All these tweens are going to get stopped, but not this one, not the alpha one. This takes in canvas group as its target. For that, we are going to have to call stop all again and pass in the canvas group. Let's try again. I'm going to set the duration to 5 one more time and call this. Okay, call it again. There you go. It just immediately stopped all the transition attached to that rect transform and called a new one. All right, that should be it for the UI motions or transitions. Now let's work on the events. What do I mean by that? Let me go to the reward page. When I enter this reward summary, once the page is opened, I want it to spin. So for that, I've added a helper component called rotate. It simply has a public function to play that is going to call tween.rotation and pass whatever settings we have here, and one more method to stop it. To test this, I've added the Odin inspectors button just to demonstrate this. So if I press play, this is going to rotate my game object in the Z axis. And when I hit stop, this is going to stop it. So I want this to play when the UI page is opened and stop when it is closed, because I don't want it to take unnecessary resource, right? If you're not seeing this UI page, we don't have to see it rotating. So in the UI page, I'm going to add more serialized fields, and this time it will be Unity event from Unity engine.events library, and I'm going to call this after initialized, and create one more to call before opened, then after opened, before closed, and after closed. So when we initialize all our components, I'm going to call after initialize dot invoke, and before we enable the game object in the open method, I'm going to call before opened dot invoke, and here I'm going to convert this into a block statement. Use block body, and before the debug line, I'm going to call after opened dot invoke, and in the close function also I'm going to call before closed dot invoke. Before the transition and after transition, I'm going to call after close dot invoke and this debug line. In the reward page, let me change the opening transition to maybe slide down. And just to exaggerate things, I'm going to set the duration to 2 maybe, and collapse this and open the UI page. And now we can see all these Unity events. And what we are interested in is the after open method. I'm going to add a callback there and reference the spinner game object and call its rotate class dot play method. And similarly, add a callback for after closed and assign the spinner game object and call its rotate.stop method. Let's press play. And now if I go to the reward page, you can see that it starts rotating after the reward summary came down. Enter again, and let's call our pause menu. And when we close this, we can see that only after the transition was complete, it debugged this line. And that concludes our video on this topic. I hope this was informative, and let me know if you have any feedback. Be sure to subscribe, and I will see you next time.